third time. Welcome to the Slavery Archive Book Club. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. I am professor at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and we are here for the third session of this book club today to discuss the book Blood in the River, on the River by Marjoleine Kars. Then I will just introduce my co-hosts, and Jessica Johnson is going to introduce Marjoleine. Then this is an initiative that we put together after COVID-19 started, and my co-hosts are Jessica Marie Johnson from Johns Hopkins University, Alex Gill from then Columbia University, and also Vanessa Holden from the University of Kentucky. Today she is not here with us. And we are broadcasting on YouTube. Also, we are on Zoom. Then those of you on Zoom, if you ask questions, you know that you are being recorded and appearing on YouTube if you want to turn on your videos and so on. We are taking questions on YouTube. Also, of course, taking questions here. You can raise your hands on Zoom, and you are going to answer the questions, and you are also taking questions on Twitter. Then thank you so much. Let's go.
Okay, so thank you everyone for being here. We are so pleased to present this work by Dr. Marjoleine Kars. Dr. Kars is an associate professor at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, in the Department of History, as well as General Women's Studies and Language and Culture. She is a prolific scholar with apologies, the notification is going to ding. Multiple award-winning articles and publications before this. This text, Blood on the River, A Chronicle of Mutiny and Freedom on the Wild Coast, was published in just this past August. We're going to give Dr. Kars some time to sort of set the stage and tell us about the work and give us a sense of what she was pursuing when she did the research and what the narrative is. And then we are going to open it up for questions. If you have questions, as Ana Lucia mentioned, you can raise your little blue hand in the Zoom. You can ask questions in the YouTube chat, or you can ask questions on Twitter, where one of us will be stationed at one of these places to keep track. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kars to take over from here.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank Anna, Vanessa, Jessica, and Alex for organizing this. I think you guys are doing a wonderful service to all of us stuck in our houses with COVID. And I also want to thank all the people who have Zoomed in or are on YouTube watching this. Thank you, and thank you in advance for your questions. So this is a book about a little known but massive and nearly successful rebellion that almost changed the history of the Americas. It took place in 1763 and 1764 in a place called Bearbeast, which later became British Guiana, now is part of the Republic of Guyana in northern South America, wedged between Venezuela on one side and Suriname on the other, and bordered in the south by Brazil. The insurgents took over the entire colony and managed to keep the Dutch at bay for more than a year. The book is a book about all the various people involved in this conflict, obviously African and African descended people, both combatants and those who did not want to be a part of it and those who may have resisted it, European colonizers and European soldiers, both soldiers from the Netherlands and soldiers from nearby colonies like St. Eustatius and Suriname. The Native Americans who were allies of the Dutch. I think that for the purposes of this talk, I'll focus mostly, of course, on what happened with African and African descended people. Blood on the River describes a really topsy-turvy world. The enslaved emancipate themselves and are in charge of the colony for more than a year, The supposedly mighty colonists are stuck on the coast on a couple of plantations, hanging on by their fingernails. The insurgent governor and the Dutch governor face very similar issues having to do with supplies and dissension in their ranks. European soldiers are unhappy almost the entire time they're there with their working conditions. And in fact, a regiment of soldiers from Suriname mutinies, and 45 of them end up joining the very rebels they had come there to fight. And then Amerindians play a crucial role in suppressing this rebellion, just as a small number of African and African descended people do, in particularly two major rebel leaders who towards the end of the rebellion betrayed their comrades and joined the judge, and without whom, according to the Dutch commander, suppressing the rebellion would have taken yet another year. And so maybe I should start at the beginning. I got involved in this when many years ago I spent time in the National Archives in The Hague. I had just finished a book on the Regulator Rebellion, which is an attempt by free farmers on the eve of the American Revolution to create greater democracy in North Carolina. And I was eager to expand beyond early America to the greater Atlantic. And I came across 100 feet of documents about a place I'd never heard of, Bearbeast, which turned out to be a Dutch colony. And then I was quite surprised to find that those records included a huge cache of documents about a slave rebellion in 1763 and 1764. And even though the rebellion was so massive and long-lasting, it had hardly been studied. But the records were really extraordinary. There was the daily journal of the governor, all kinds of correspondence between colonists and the mother country, reports by soldiers and officers, sort of the usual stuff that you find in the colonial archive. But then more surprisingly, there were about 500 pages of judicial investigations of people re-enslaved after the rebellion was suppressed, and a quite extensive correspondence between the leader of the rebels, Governor Coffee, and the Dutch governor. And in fact, almost 900 adults, which is almost half of the people who survived the rebellion, were either questioned or interrogated by the Dutch afterwards. And these records, of course, suffer from all the usual problems that records have that are created under duress, right? People had to answer very specific and leading questions under frightening circumstances. They had every reason to lie and to omit. Their answers were summarized by a Dutch clerk who also translated Creole into Dutch and turned their answers most of the time into the third person. Many of these testimonies were short, but others go on for pages. And unlike me, the Dutch were not interested in the internal workings of the rebellion. They were interested in basically three things: who had been a leader, who had destroyed Dutch property, mostly through arson, and most importantly, who had committed what they called Christian murder. And so since their lives were on the line and the lives of those they loved, as I said, African and African descended people had every reason to distort and to omit and to lie in their answers. It's hard to know how to read those words without seeing people, and a little bit like teaching into the void on Zoom when you can't see people's faces and the hesitations and silences and so on, which provide important emotional cues. And yet, of course, despite such caveats, I think that this is important testimony that provide a first-hand look at the lived realities of rebellion and the politics of rebellion in really intimate, granular detail. These records tell us not only about rebel leaders, but more rare in the records of the Atlantic world, 18th century Atlantic world anyway, about how ordinary people experienced rebellion. They chronicle how they fought with Europeans and with Amerindians, how they dealt with the traumas of war as they struggled to survive, And more intriguingly, the records expose deep divisions in how people envision this freedom that they're fighting for. What freedom and autonomy meant to people who were living so close to death. And I was particularly interested in that part of the rebellion because I had just finished a book on the American Revolution, which is a similarly complex upheaval in which people differed greatly about what they considered independence and autonomy and freedom ought to mean. And I sort of wondered whether, and which was also a rebellion in which people were both fighting an anti-colonial war and fighting to see who would be in charge at home. And so I wondered whether this slave rebellion would be as complex as what I had learned from the American Revolution. And so I decided to work on this, and I'm now lost my place. So maybe I should sort of quickly sketch for you what the main events of the rebellion were for people who have not had a chance to read the book. Bearbeast was a small Caribbean colony. It was owned privately by the Company of Bearbeast, group of investors in Amsterdam, but under the auspices of the Dutch government, the States General. Just 350 Europeans lived there. They incarcerated about 4,500 African and African descended people and maybe another 350 native people on plantations where they made people grow coffee and cotton and cocoa, and only about a third grew sugar. And the people who grew sugar were all people who lived on company plantations, plantations owned by the Society of Bearbeast itself. There were only about 10 of those. Plantations were strung around along the rivers, the Bearbeast River and its tributary, the Kanji, for about 80 miles, starting about 30 miles from the coast inland. And beyond that little sliver of control, there stretched savannas and jungle where the Dutch and most African people too were unfamiliar, and which were inhabited by Amerindians. In the decade before the rebellion, Bearbeast had been plagued by drought and by crop failures and by massive epidemics, which had brought enslaved people to the breaking point. And they started the rebellion on a Sunday, as most rebellions, in February of 1763, spread super rapidly. The Dutch basically don't fight back at all. They're totally panicked. They flee to the coast, pursued by their formerly enslaved workers. And when they get to the coast, most of them take off for Europe or for neighboring colonies. And the remainder hole up on this sugar plantation near the coast, aided by their colonial neighbors who send soldiers and food and supplies and begin to round up Native American allies who will also come to the aid of Bearbeast. And for much of that spring and summer, the rebels and the Dutch are sort of warily watching each other. They're in a stalemate. Neither is strong enough to defeat the other. And the leader of the rebellion, a man named Kofi, several times tries to initiate diplomacy, or he initiates diplomacy through these written letters, trying to bring the conflict to an end by non-military means, but he's not successful. In fact, his negotiations turn his own people against him. There is a coup against him in the fall. He commits suicide, and he is succeeded by an African man named Atta. And really not until massive military help arrives from the Dutch Republic at the end of 1763 do the Dutch begin a counter-offensive, and even then it takes them, even with the help of their Native American allies, until well into the summer of 1764, to defeat these insurgents who have no allies and who lack the long Atlantic reach that allows the Dutch to be resupplied and to get military help. And so the book chronicles the political and military interactions of rebels and colonists. But the more interesting part of the book to me is what it reveals about the internal dynamics of rebellion. And those internal dynamics reveal how, as in pretty much all rebellions and revolutions, people were divided politically along a number of lines, including ethnicity and in terms of their political visions. So let me talk about that a little bit. The rebels were led, as I said, by a man who styled himself Governor Coffee and his second in command, Captain Atta. They were both Amina from the Gold Coast, and Vince Brown has recently written about the Coromantee and their role in Tacky's rebellion in Jamaica in 1760 and 1761. And what are the Coromantee in English are the Amina in Dutch. They're the same folks. The Amina came from a region in Africa that was steeped in warfare, much of it connected to the Atlantic slave trade, and many Amina men were skilled fighters. The Amina are in charge of this rebellion, but many people who claim other national identities, who belong to other nations, as they were called, including Creoles, participate in the Bearbeast rebellion. And it's really not until the rebellion becomes more diffuse after Coffee's suicide that these ethnic conflicts and intra-violence among rebels increase. So Coffee and Atta organize an army. They organize a government that enforces compliance with their rules, neutralizes their opponents, and crafts strategy. And they collect food and supplies and guns. They force people on company plantations back into the field to create the sugar that's needed to make rum. And they force other people to work in kitchen gardens in order to supply both their supporters and the army. Rebel officials and leaders are attended by servants and slaves. And so the Amina create a rebellion that is hierarchical and, like most major political conflicts, employed both coercion and violence. In a series of letters to the Dutch government, as I mentioned, Governor Coffee lays out his quite bold vision for freedom. He repeatedly proposes that they should divide the colony in two. And he says to the Dutch, you guys can have the part that's closest to the ocean. We will take the part that's further upriver. And in starting these negotiations, he's certainly not the first self-liberated man to engage in negotiations with his colonial enemies. While we have few letters directly from slave rebels, we do know that particularly Maroons and colonial authorities negotiated quite often, and there are numerous examples of peace treaties all over the Americas over the 400 years of enslavement. And Coffee may well have heard about the negotiations in Jamaica in the late 1730s and early 1740s with Maroons, or much more recently, the negotiations that the Dutch authorities conducted with Maroons in neighboring Suriname that led to treaties in 1760 and 1762. But Coffee is proposing something on a much grander scale. He initiated these negotiations. It was not the colonial authorities did so. And he approaches the Dutch governor as one statement, one head of state to another. His proposal to divide the colony in two is really quite unprecedented and bold, I think. And he does not offer to retreat with his people to the jungle. Rather, he suggests that he's going to live alongside the Dutch as one nation next to another. And it also appears that he wants free trade. He wants to also trade with the Dutch. He wants to trade with any ship that calls on the colony. And it appears that he's not after subsistence and autonomy in Maroon fashion, but is really interested in sort of participating in capitalist style production and trade. He wants to keep clearly the sugar plantations in production, likely with forced labor, as he has been doing, in order to grow rum for the rebels' own consumption, but also to trade more than likely on the international market, just as the Dutch colonists do. Some 30 years later, rebels in Haiti, when they succeed in booting out their enslavers, they do the same thing. They compel newly liberated people to grow sugar on plantations under force, which is probably the only way you can get people to grow sugar. And so while Governor Coffey's radical vision turns his rebellion into a revolution, it's also likely that it turns off many of the rank and file. In fact, African and African descended people's responses to the insurgency and their allegiances ran the gamut, from strong support to evasion and dodging. People's decisions about whether to join or not hinged on their own personal situations, the social tensions on their plantations, as well as larger political, ideological, and strategic considerations, of course. Few people chose to side with the Dutch. Many more joined the rebels, and just about everybody plundered their plantation mansions, or, well, in Bearbeast are hardly mansions, their plantation houses, taking back the stuff that their own labor had wrought. But whatever their sympathies, when it comes to committing themselves to rebellion, many were aloof as long as they could be, attempting to stay autonomous or out of the fray until they really had no more choice and they had to make, and they had to commit to one side or the other. People hid in the rainforest or in the jungle behind their plantations as soon as the rebels approached, or the Dutch approached, or the Indians approached, and moved back onto their plantations as soon as the coast was clear. Now, I argue that hiding from the rebels signaled much more than a fearful refusal to engage in, admittedly, a very dangerous rebellion, but that avoiding the rebels was a political statement about preferring life without masters, a declaration of independence, if you want, or if you will. Like self-governing people throughout history, the non-committed sought to evade war, the appropriation of their labor, and outside rule. In dodging all combatants, they became fugitives in their own backyards, living independently of both the Dutch and the rebels. They camped in their own communities near their gardens and near plantation pantries, where subsistence agriculture required little, if any, coercion. This alternative, I think, especially for women and children and the less able-bodied, would have been preferable to joining a military campaign or being incorporated into a rebellion as workers. And it's also likely that such a stance was inspired by experiences that people had back in West Africa, where the slave trade in the 18th century foments powerful, hierarchical, and militarized states in the 18th century, and African commoners increasingly came to resist and grow wary of rulers who appropriated their labor through taxation, turned their sons into soldiers, and fed growing numbers of people to Europeans on the coast. And I think that this has been described by a number of people, most recently perhaps Toby Green. So in the fall of 1763, as I said, Coffey was deposed in a coup, and with him this notion of an independent state or an independent colony dies. But questions remained over social hierarchy, over military strategy, and over what life after emancipation was going to look like. Coffey had sought to produce or reproduce a Dutch-style colony. His successor, Atta, an African, had his own designs for a centralized chain of command. It appears that he envisioned a more traditional Maroon polity, removed from institutions of European capitalism and chattel slavery and merchant capitalism, but he was very authoritarian, and many of his officers varied of his style of ruling and became his opponents. And perhaps they had come around to this non-state solution, decentralized communities that relied upon subsistence agriculture and in which people retained a large amount of autonomy and encountered very little coercion. And that solution probably appealed not only to the Dodgers, as I argue, but to many of Atta's rank and file. And so in closing then, Blood of the River argues that the politics of the Bearbeast Rebellion were as complex as any other in this era, that the leaders of the rebellion wanted the liberty to run a colony of their own, with a measure of bondage in place, and that ordinary self-emancipated people wanted autonomy to tend their own gardens, and they did not want to be ruled by anybody. And I think that this difference of how people filled in what life would be like after emancipation is a common theme in the revolutionary age. Elites and commoners had different ideas. Elites wanted one thing, commoners wanted another, and everybody called it freedom. And so by investigating the internal politics of this rebellion, I'm hoping that the book contributes to the intellectual and political history of African and African descended people, and that it also expands and certainly adds to our knowledge of, but perhaps also expands our definition of what we consider to be the age of revolution to be. So maybe I'll leave it there and allow people to ask questions about any of this. I'll get my pen ready.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for that. We can open it up now for questions. Again, you can raise your hand in the queue in Zoom. You can ask questions on YouTube, and we're also taking questions on Twitter. Slavery Archive is a hashtag. I can open it up with a question that I have. Just to kind of warm things up a little bit. The work is so fascinating and so rich and dense in the ways that the internal dynamics of the enslaved community of Africans and their various visions as you're laying out for what life in freedom, life post-slavery looks like. I'm wondering if there are ways that you can think about situating this revolt in the larger context of the 1760s. I mean, we did have, you mentioned it, Tacky's Revolt was kind of the inaugural Slavery Archive book club, and it's also happening in the same moment. The 1760s seems to be this rife decade, and so I'm wondering if you could speak anything to that, or is there anything to this particular historical moment that we should keep in mind beyond Bearbeast that can bring us also into the ways that these are conversations and ideas about freedom that are circling the Atlantic, maybe, or maybe they're not. I'd leave it to you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. And well, obviously, the age of revolution, as it's traditionally been defined, sort of starts with the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, and runs through the American, French, Haitian revolutions and Latin American movements for independence in the 1820s. And Vince does a beautiful job of seeing Tacky as a major battle in the 7 Years' War for the British. I think that connection is not nearly as clear for Bearbeast. The Dutch are neutral during the 7 Years' War, as the Dutch generally tend to be or try to be in wars. Their supply ships are certainly hindered in reaching Bearbeast because of the war, which no doubt increases hunger among the enslaved in Bearbeast and increases people's misery. I think that this rebellion, along with Tacky and also Native American movements in North America, for instance, should all be seen as the beginning of this age of revolution. I could not find the kind of connections that Vince found in Jamaica here. There are certainly connections to Suriname, but they're very under the surface. But it does seem to me that the rebels in Bearbeast knew about what had happened in Suriname, and there is some evidence that they are trying to get in touch with Surinamese Maroons. The governor of Suriname almost immediately sends emissaries to the Maroons in Suriname saying, you know, don't join these rebels. In fact, we really need you on our side as the treaties require you to. And so I think that the 1760s are a period when people all over the Americas are beginning to think whether it's as part of the American Revolution, it's as part of Pontiac's rebellion, it's as part of the slave rebellions about what a better world can look like. I think the 7 Years' War has some influence on this in Bearbeast, much more clearly in the British Empire, I think, than in the Dutch. But I haven't found super clear smoking guns, if that answers it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. We have folks queuing up, so why don't we jump right in? Philip Warfield, let's start with you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for your work. I thought it was incredible. I really enjoyed reading it. My name is Philip Warfield. I'm a first-year Howard University student, and I just had a question about the way that you approached it. And so I just wanted to ask you, it seems like you're deliberately trying to relate to the American experience and all the examples you used with American history. So why is that audience, besides the Dutch audience, so important to your work?
Great question. Thanks very much for that. I wanted to use American examples in part because I live in North America. I teach in a North American university. I was trained as an early Americanist. And I wanted Americans, meaning US folks, who read these books to be able to situate it a little bit in a context they might be familiar with. I'm also personally very interested in the American Revolution. I still work in that field, and I have often felt that slave revolts are too much sort of in their own historiographical corner. And I was interested in saying, in looking at, and then once I looked at it, in saying, slave rebellions are also complex. There is nothing easy about rebellion. There is people are not just united just because they were horribly oppressed in similar ways. It's similar, and the violence and the coercion also happen in the American Revolution. So I'm trying to both demystify the American Revolution for people a little bit and saying we need to see all these rebellions and revolutions in relationship to each other and not treat one group as if they're all by themselves, even if their situation, of course, had particularities specific to them. So that's why I put it more in an American context. It's partly where I come from. Does that answer it?
Yes, ma'am, it does. Thank you. I was curious about that. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, we have Ebony Davis next. Ebony, you're up.
Hi, Ebony.
Hello. Yes, I really enjoyed the book. In the beginning, you discussed, you share a little bit about your trip there and how you kind of came across small remnants of the Bearbeast colonies and whatnot. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about that, and if there were any, like, I know you referenced that your guide was telling you that these are the trees that people would bury, like their treasure under when they were abandoning their plantation. Were there other anecdotes like that that you came across on your visit?
Unfortunately, very few, even though there is a big statue to coffee in Georgetown that was, I think, put there in the 1760s. People seemed to actually know very little about that rebellion, or they didn't want to tell me. That's of course also possible, but I got the feeling that people didn't know that much. The woman who led us around at the place where the fort was built and where the Dutch governor resided, and where later Governor Coffee sets up his government, she knew a little bit more. She talked about how the rebels used that huge tree to bang their messages and that they could travel as far as the Kanji River. But she was there as an historical guide. The regular folks who lived across the river, whom I asked, would all say, we really don't know much about it. They were more forthcoming about how there used to be these remnants of Dutch plantations, and how people regularly go over there to see whether they can find anything, and how over the years people had pretty much used everything they could, down to the stones in the foundation, which people took out and used to sharpen their knives. And they would tell me, even 15 years ago, you could still find stuff, but now it's pretty much gone. And what I found were all shards. So one day after a big rain, these shards of pottery and glass just sort of bubbled up from the earth. And the owner of the ranch where I was staying, I collected a bunch of it, and he said, you can keep it if you want to. And I took some representative pieces home. And on the maps, you can still see all the names of the old plantation are still used on modern maps. But that's about it. The jungle really reclaims things very rapidly, and Bearbeast is a poor country, although now with the discovery of oil offshore, who knows what will happen.
Thank you.
So not nearly as many stories as I would have liked. I think that I'm hoping that when COVID is over, I can go back and talk about the book. I've gotten some emails from people from Guyana saying that they are beginning to read it and they like it. And I wonder if I'm there now, having researched the entire thing and being able to share stories with people, I may get some more stories back.
That would be good. So, I'm sorry, one tiny follow-up. Do you think people weren't aware that it happened at all, or they just didn't know much about it?
They were definitely aware that it happened, but they didn't know a great deal about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I think many of us after COVID are hoping to kind of get back to the communities that we're working with and excited about. We have a question from the floor. We have a question from God Human, unless he would like to ask it himself. Are you interested in that?
Sure, of course.
Okay, go for it.
So, Marjoleine, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, how are you doing?
Hey, how are you? Thank you very much for your really interesting book. And I'm really interested in the rationale for the rebellion. So in your book, you said the enslaved said that the masters did not give the slaves what was their due. Mm-hmm. So that's a really interesting point. And I think it'd be interesting for people involved in this, if you could expand on that point.
Sure, thanks for that. So from the very beginning, the rebels sent either notes or messages to the Dutch, so much like, and I have to apologize to Philip to use an American example, the Americans feel compelled to explain their reasoning in their Declaration of Independence. And in the notes, the rebels say, they mention particular owners by name, which are all the owners and overseers on the 5 or 6 plantations where the rebellion first starts and where Coffee and Akara live. And they mention these men specifically, and they say these men did not give us what was our due. They sent a European woman with a message, and she makes pretty clear that these men had forced themselves on enslaved women, that they had not given the rations that people expected, that people had been hungry, that they had been abused beyond I guess what was a normal level of abuse. And they mentioned that over and over. So I think that they wanted to, and a little bit sort of like the Americans in the pre-revolutionary period who keep saying it's the ministers, it's not the king we have a problem with, it's his ministers. So they keep saying, you know, we don't really have a beef with you, governor, it's really with these horrible men who have abused us very badly. And they never waver from saying that. And I think that they're doing it in part because they're trying to justify why the breaking point came now. I think they are trying to perhaps make these men's names public, perhaps hoping that if they don't succeed, maybe something will happen to them. And because anything bigger, I think is, I think they think would have fallen on deaf ears. Although the Dutch don't seem particularly surprised that people rebel. They seem to pretty much feel like, well, yeah, of course they rebel. I mean, who wouldn't? They don't want that rebellion and they want their colony back, but they don't seem particularly surprised. And they never ask about it either. They never ask people later, why did you do this? What were you after? Mm-hmm. They don't.
But it's if I may ask, it's interesting. I mean, it's almost impossible to answer, but what was the level of abuse which was acceptable? It's almost impossible to imagine what that would have been.
Yes, I think that's true. Although I think that it is clear that people felt, and there's a little rebellion before this major one that happens in 1762. And in that rebellion, it's one plantation, pretty much an entire plantation. And the man who leads it is a bombe, as a driver is called in Bearbeast. And he apparently talks similarly. He's saying people who don't get to eat shouldn't have to work. And there is tremendous hunger in this time period. So he is suggesting that there is a minimum amount of food where when it gets below that, people just cannot do it and they won't do it. And he is saying to folks, we really shouldn't continue to work if this is what it's going to be like. So it seems like a similar rationale that as oppressed people everywhere, there is a certain level of oppression that people can live with because they don't have much choice. But there comes a point where they can't anymore, and then they're willing to take desperate and drastic measures, even though that means putting their lives on the line. But where that line lies exactly, I don't think anybody can say, and that differs from place to place, and it differs for different people.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
We have Antonio Austin. Thank you so much.
Hi, I really enjoyed your book. My name is Antonio Austin, and I'm a first-year PhD student in the Department of History at Howard University as well.
Hi.
My question is, in your research journey, in regard to this book, what was the most surprising discovery that you made? Surprising as in good, or something that you thought was extremely challenging to bear?
There were so many things that were surprising in the sense that I had studied slavery for a long time. But when you read it for yourself in the records, it becomes a different thing. And so many of the records give you a sense of immediacy where you hear people's voices in a way that reading it in a book filtered through somebody else's mind doesn't quite hit you in the same way. I just the other day came, for instance, across a record where a man in Bearbeast, an African man who has just arrived about 2 months earlier, brought on a slave ship, kills his wife. And the Dutch interrogate him, and he says, well, she and I came on the slave ship together, and when we arrived here, we were sent to the same plantation. And I said to her, let's stay together. We've been good to each other. We were really helpful to each other on the ship. Let's stay together, which is all already surprising because men and women were often separated on ships. And while women had more freedom of movement, what exactly did he mean? That they took good care of each other? Were they married or not? Was it just in his mind? But regardless, so he told her that he wanted to stay together and she wanted nothing to do with him anymore. And he said, in fact, she had taken up with a young Creole man. And he had to watch her every day with somebody else and he just couldn't take it. And so he had hit her with an axe. He hadn't meant to kill her, but he did kill her. And the story, I found it such an affecting story because both of these people paid for it with their lives, right? They both had just gone through this horrific ordeal called the Middle Passage. Perhaps the woman didn't want to stay with him because he reminded her too much of that. Maybe they were never together. It was only in his mind. Maybe she took up with a young Creole man because he could take care of her much better than a freshly arrived man from Africa who would have had no gardens, no chickens, no connections. And at the same time, you could just sort of feel the desperation in him, even though he did a horrible thing. And so there were lots of records like that. The Bearbeast records are totally not used for the 18th century and filled with these human interest is not the right word, but these stories that just bring tears to your eyes when you read them and make you think about what enslavement meant on so many different levels. And I think one of the things that did not surprise me perhaps so much, but I found very poignant, is to see how much what happened among enslaved people on their own plantations was obviously as important to them as this master-slave relationship that we as historians so often focus on. There was lots of stuff going on in the community itself, obviously, among people, and that took up a lot of their time and their headspace, even as they tried to cope with what these colonizers and slaveholders were doing to them.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Antonio, and I'll be seeing you on a seminar, I'm sure.
You sure will.
We have Amanda Banegas. Next up.
Hello, so yes, my name is Amanda Banegas. I am also a first-year PhD student at Howard University in the history department. So I guess that I have more of a comment. Well, first things first, I really, really enjoyed the book and particularly the topic. Not too long ago, myself and actually Amber, she's in this seminar as well. She's a classmate of mine. We're talking about how much of the resistance or the rebellions that, we read and we're exposed to focus in on the United States, but it meant so much to me, as a Caribbean woman to read about this particular rebellion because it highlights the fact that, enslaved folks were also resisting and rebelling prior to Haiti all throughout the Caribbean. So that honestly just meant so much to me. And I will really be looking through your sources in particular just to further read on the topic and the different rebellions occurring during this time and after.
Well, thank you very much. That's wonderful to hear. And think about studying Dutch, because there's so much to be done. So much to be done. Did you have a question too?
So I don't have a question. It was just really that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. So we have next up Dominic. Dominic, you're up.
Cool. Thank you. In your answer to Ebony's question, you touched on this a little, so feel free to skip over it if you like. But you mentioned historical preservation is underserved in the region. Do you think future archaeological work will augment our understanding of the rebellion in any significant way, or about slavery in the colony in general? Were there any specific questions that you think the archaeological record might be able to answer for us, or do you think it'll more or less reinforce what the historical record has already presented?
Thanks for that. You know, the only archaeology that has been done in Bearbeast is almost all about Amerindians very far in the past. The place where I stayed, Dubulai Ranch, which used to be Perenboom Plantation, people have done some archaeological digs, and it's all about how it was a place where Amerindians already lived 6,000 years ago. I'm not sure. I think anytime we do research, it adds to our knowledge and we learn new stuff. And some of those pottery shards I found intriguing because I could see the fingerprints in the edges. And I wondered whether, you know, in the United States, there was much pottery that had always been, as people had thought that it was made by Amerindians, and then people like Teresa Singletary, I think is her name, showed that this was actually pottery made by enslaved Africans in the American South. And so I'm certainly hoping that people will dig up more of that stuff and figure out who did it. Whether there is, and we will learn, I presume, more from archaeology about trash middens and what people may have eaten and how they may have supplemented their foods and what kind of things they grew and so on and so forth. Whether it will substantially change the narrative of the rebellion, I don't know. I imagine that other people will look at this rebellion besides myself. I certainly hope they will. And I imagine they will come up with different ways of looking at it, including archaeologists perhaps. But I don't have a specific question in mind where I thought, oh, I wish an archaeologist would get on that. I just wish there was more work on 18th century Bearbeast in general.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Hey, thank you, Dominic. We have Esther Adams next.
I am extremely delighted by this book because one, I'm a Guyanese, and I guess other than Alvin Thompson or Anna Benjamin, there isn't much on the 1763 Bearbeast Rebellion. But I'm a little, I guess maybe I have more of a comment than a question as it relates to the level of knowledge that the general Guyanese public has about the 1763 Rebellion. And I found it so strange that you got the impression that, you know, people didn't really know much about it because, I mean, for one, it is part of the school curriculum, not only the Guyanese curriculum, but of course the Caribbean curriculum, because it's a part of the CXC curriculum. And I mean, like, the Republic anniversary is celebrated on the 23rd of February for a reason, because it really is because of the 1763 rebellion. Because of course there's debate on whether it started on the 23rd of February or not, or that's beside the point. But I'm just wondering if your guides or the persons that you interacted with, because sometimes a lot, as Guyanese, we feel that, oh, people just come and they just want to hear all that we have to say, and then they go and they write their books, and sometimes they acknowledge us, sometimes they don't. So I'm just wondering if that could be the case, that persons were reluctant to share a lot of that with you because of those reasons. I'm also wondering if you had any connections or any contacts with the university, like the history department of the university or anything like that. I'm just curious about that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that comment. I mean, I think I said when I talked about it that it could be that people didn't want to talk to me about it. I was in Guyana for only about a week. And so I talked to the people who lived on the river near Dubulai Ranch, which is a particular kind of place. And that may have also made a difference. But when I asked people, and I wasn't really asking them, they would say, well, what are you doing here? And I would say, well, I'm doing research about this rebellion that happened in 1763. What do you know? Do you know anything about it? What do you know about it? Sort of in a conversation, they would usually say, I really don't know all that much. So I don't know whether I spoke to older people who had not yet had this in their curriculum, or whether they indeed didn't want to say. And that's why I'm hoping when I go back with the book in hand, that people might feel differently. I had a hard time getting in touch with people in Guyana, and I tried very hard, for instance, to meet up with Anna Benjamin, did not succeed, and with people at the Ross Museum, and I did not have contact with people at the university. But I'm hoping that will change should I have a chance to visit when this is over. So thank you for reading it, and thank you for correcting me and saying it is in the curriculum. People do know about it. I did see some articles about it in the Stabroek newspaper too.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
We have Alex Baruki, who has been waiting very patiently. So please, Alex, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Jessica. And first of all, I really want to thank Ana Lucia, Alex, Jessica, and the other person for doing this, because it takes a lot of work, a lot of emails, and a lot of clicks to do this kind of things, indeed. I have a question, a commentary and a question. On the commentary, it's regarding one question at the beginning regarding the 7 Years' War. And in the 7 Years' War, the Dutch actually was somewhat of the lifeline for commerce for the Spanish in Venezuela. So the Spanish, since there was waging war against the British, they didn't have the ships to go there. And the Spanish in Caracas, in La Guaira, in Trinidad, pretty much depended on that shipping, which really may have contributed to lack of foodstuff and resources in Dutch colonies, in the neighboring Dutch colonies, because the Spaniards will pay in silver, they pay wartime prices, so you know what I mean. Another good commentary is that I have seen how Marjoleine have incremented your comparisons regarding with Latin American examples to these rebellions since the time you presented here in UC Irvine to the moment that I see the book indeed, and it goes through the book, that issue. And my comment, now my question, it's regarding format. Since the beginning you envisioned this book as a trade book, as a book that was for a broad audience, that it was meant to have a broad readership beyond history curricula or beyond people interested on the African diaspora in the Americas. My question is, did you leave something out of the book because you envision yourself writing in that format, or did you have you worked somewhat differently if you have done a more orthodox, let's say that, monography as an history monograph?
Thanks, both thanks for the comments, Alex. And I just got Hohenhout's book, you know, about Demerara and Essequibo, which deals a lot with connections with the Spanish, but I haven't yet hadn't had a chance to read it. In terms of, I wanted to write this as a trade book in part because I wanted it read in the Netherlands. I thought if I, as an Atlantic historian, don't know about Bearbeast and this rebellion, then the Dutch don't know anything about it at all. And there is a growing discussion about racism in the Netherlands, which is much needed. And I think that people need to learn about this history and how it has contributed to to base relations in the present in the Netherlands and its former colonies. And so I thought if I write it as a story, people are more likely to read the whole thing, and they're more likely to pick it up at all. And it is also a what do you call it? It lends itself well to being told chronologically. So it seemed the natural way to do it. Had I made it into a more traditional monograph, I think I would have had more analysis in it, more at least analysis out on the surface. I might have elaborated on that more. It would have probably been a longer book. I cut 50,000 words from the manuscript in my last year of working on it. And I had such rich material about Bearbeast itself that, you know, when I read Vincent Brown's book, which has this marvelous context that he creates, he and I sort of have opposite problems. I had a huge number of records and he had relatively few. And so he gets at it by sort of setting a context and then moving in. And my issue was more that I had so much that it was more a matter of being in it and then moving out a little bit. I think had it been a monograph, it would have been longer and there would have been more of that in it. But I enjoyed writing it this way, and I wish that we more often wrote books so that non-academics want to read them. And I am sort of sold on it now and want to keep going in this vein, I think. And then one can use articles like the article I wrote about the situation of women to be more analytical and to be more for an audience of one's professional peers. Is that, yeah? Okay, great. Thumbs up.
Thank you, Alex. Next up, we have Amber Anderson.
Hello, I'm Amber,
Hi.
a first year master student in the history department. I'm sorry if my question seems kind of basic, but I'd like to refer to myself as a history nerd. So I just wanted to know, like, how you felt when you actually came across these sources. Like, I also as like being a descendant of an African or Africans, I just want to know, like, what did it mean to you as a person who has studied, you know, slavery for quite a while? How did these coming across these sources make you feel?
Well, thanks for the question, Amber. Not particularly terribly basic at all, I don't think. But when I came across them, I was super excited. I mean, I had almost all that I had studied in grad school had been about the African diaspora. I am obviously interested in rebellions because my first book was about a rebellion too, albeit of a different group of people. And I remember finding these records in the archives in The Hague, and I immediately got on their computer. And in those days, sending an email was still kind of complicated. And I wrote one of my former professors at Duke, Barry Gaspar, and I said, Barry, I found all these records about this place, Bearbeast, and this rebellion. What do you what do you think? And he wrote me back and he said, whoa, that's really cool. We know almost nothing about this rebellion. I think you should write about it. And I thought, yeah, I'm going to do that. I want to do that. It's a super important topic. It allows me to make an intervention in the Netherlands. It fits with my interests. It's a rebellion, which clearly those moments of rupture are what I find particularly satisfying as an historian. And there were so many records, and it was all new to me in terms of, I didn't know anything about Bearbeast. I knew very little about Dutch history. And so it was yeah, I sort of felt like, whoa, I found my project. This is what I want to do. But I think that often when you find records, checking with somebody else is a good idea. And to say, you know, what do you think? Is this just me getting excited, or is this really exciting? And so you see that even after you finish a book, your old professors still remain part of your life, which is nice.
Thank you, Amber. We have a question from Ana Lucia.
I can unmute myself. Then Marjoleine, I would have considering that we had also this discussion on the book by Vincent Brown, then on the Texas Rebellion, and considering the fact that this is a rebellion that happens also in this period, the so-called period of the age of revolutions, I ask myself how this rebellion relates with these other rebellions that took place at the same time, and also beyond that area that is the Caribbean. Because one of the elements that we could think about that period of the 18th century as a period when all these rebellions were in different ways connected, then what were the similarities that we can see in the case of Bearbeast and the cases that we see, for example, in Jamaica or in other Caribbean regions. And one of the elements also that I wanted to point out is the issue that is a similar question that I asked to Vincent, is regarding the memory of this rebellion. Because the fact that we have there this monument of 1976, which is a federal monument, then that was embraced as a part of a sort of political project, then connecting the end of colonialism and also the end of slavery. And we see a similar project in other Caribbean countries where these monuments to slave rebels were conceived. But apparently, from what you are saying, there is a disconnection between an official initiative with speeches at the time by, I think that is Burhan, that was the president, and so on, and how the population on a daily basis know about the rebellion itself. And in 2013, there was then the anniversary of the rebellion, and there were initiatives as well. And despite all that, then at least on the ground, this rebellion remains forgotten, and apparently forgotten also in the Netherlands. Then it would be these two elements. Then on the one hand, how the rebellion relates or not to what we see elsewhere. Is there any element here that is peculiar to this rebellion that we do not see elsewhere? And at the same time, the issue of memorialization.
Okay. Oh, that's a lot, Anna. Thank you. The first question, I think I talked about a little bit earlier when somebody asked about the age of revolution and what is going on in the 1760s, that so many of these rebellions seem to happen. One thing, obviously, that's going on in terms of enslaved people is that so many folks are arriving from the Gold Coast in the Dutch colonies and also in Jamaica, and that these people bring a particular spirit and set of skills with them that we have to see as connected. I mean, it's probably no accident that both in Jamaica and in Bearbeast, the main rebel leaders are Coromantee or Amina. So I think the 7 Years' War is connected. All that stirs up, the talk about changes in the British Empire, perhaps as Alex talked about the 7 Years' War in terms of Dutch supply ships going to supply the Spanish rather than Bearbeast. So yes, there's something going on in the 1760s that makes it a very exciting time. And I think it's a combination of what is happening in West Africa and what is happening in the Americas itself. In terms of the commemorization of the Guyana, the rebellion, I think in part, the records for this rebellion all live in the Netherlands, or largely live in the Netherlands. Some in Kew and some are in Georgetown, but the most of them are in the Netherlands. And the Dutch have just begun to digitize them all so that they can be repatriated to various countries, including Guyana. But most people there do not read Dutch. And so I think that I've been set straight that more people know about this rebellion than it might seem. But I think that the depth of knowledge about the rebellion is perhaps not as deep as what this book can provide, because I had access to so many more records than people there have. And the commemorization is very much tied, I think, to politics in Guyana at the moment and conflicts between ethnic groups that come out of the end of slavery and then the creation of a system of contract workers from Asia. And as we know in the United States, these commemorations get hitched to particular political visions, and they don't necessarily have all that much to do with what we know to have been historical. Truth is too much, but what we see in the historical record. And so I think that the commemorization is one where a particular version of the rebellion is put forth by different groups and people get attached to that particular version. And so in that respect, I wondered how the book will fit. And that will be very interesting to see. And yeah.
Excellent. I see a break in the queue, so I'm going to take that as an opportunity to jump in with a second question. Oh no, Joe Reedy. I defer to the illustrious. Joe Reedy, you are up. You're up next.
Okay. Thank you, Jessica. Marjoleine, I enjoyed the book thoroughly myself. And you summarized earlier very nicely the kind of political sensibility that Kofi brought into the negotiation. And you made the case of how unusual, if not unprecedented, it was, in the sense that he considered himself the equivalent of a head of state who could have negotiated with the Dutch governor on a platform of equality. And he said quite a bit about the political sophistication and the thinking that went in on both sides of that negotiation. But one thing that both this conversation and my reading of the book is still wondering a little bit more about, that I would ask you now to perhaps explain a little bit more, is what kind of racial ideology is running parallel with this sophisticated political ideology on the part of both the Dutch as well as the Creoles and the Africans, and no doubt the American Indians as well. How do they perceive this interaction that, of course, results in the rebellion through the kind of racial lenses that are becoming so popular a way of people from Europe and Africa and the Americas interacting with each other during precisely this period of intense political antagonism in the 1760s.
So if I understand you correctly, you're asking me to talk about the racial lenses that various groups bring with them to this conflict and to the negotiations between the Dutch and Kofi and his people. Is that correct?
Yes, and to put perhaps a point on it, the Dutch governor, Van Hugenheim, right? Why would he negotiate with Kofi in the first place? Now, I think you make a strong case that from a political standpoint, in other words, from an instrumental standpoint, he realized that he had to. But what enabled him, in effect, to get beyond his racial supposition about any African or African descended person to enable him to enter into those negotiations? And by the same token, how would Kofi have envisioned going into a negotiation if he looked through the prism of what he perceived that the Dutch might be in terms of how they would interact, how they would recognize as legitimate such a conversation, and how they would abide by the results of any negotiation that will come out of that?
Boy, those are big questions. Thank you. I think that the governor is negotiating because he thinks it's, as you point out, politically he thinks that it will buy him time. But the language he uses in his negotiations is, to me, profoundly racist. I mean, he talks down to Kofi, he writes in broken Dutch, he refers to himself in the third person, he sounds like he's talking to children. He is not, in his mind, I don't think, talking to an equal. I think that Kofi is perhaps also playing a bit of a double game, because during one set of those negotiations, his men are also attacking the Dutch militarily, and he then says, "Oh, that happened without my knowledge. I did not authorize that," and that's possible. Later events suggest that that is quite possible, but it's also possible that he's doing what is not uncommon in other places, including West Africa, which is that you negotiate while you're applying military pressure, so that you're putting a bit of bite behind your words. And I think that, I don't know, but I would imagine that he thinks that the Dutch are in an awful pickle, that they don't seem to be getting much help from home, that they may go along with this to save themselves, and that if he plays his cards right, he might be strong enough to force them to abide by that agreement. I don't think he has any particular illusions about Dutch honor or anything like that. I think he's being pragmatic and thinking, if we play our cards right and we manage to feed ourselves and we can trade and get more guns and we can remain powerful, then the Dutch may not have a choice but to suffer us to live next to them. But I don't know. Kofi is an enigmatic person. We know relatively little about him besides these letters, which he did not write himself. They were written by initially an enslaved man named Prince, I believe, and then later by one of these Surinamese soldiers who mutiny and end up joining the rebels. And I wonder in the book to what extent Kofi makes them read the letters back to him, and to what extent he might be able to read enough himself that he can double check that what they read is indeed what they wrote. Other than that, I'm not sure I can give much more detail to your question. I think that racism is certainly alive and well among the Dutch. What kind of racialized thinking enslaved people are engaging in, I really don't have access to.
but it's intriguing how you're describing the politics of the situation, in effect, overriding the racial stereotypes, certainly on the part of the Dutch.
I think that the Dutch are most of the time pretty, we would say nuchter in Dutch, which means sober. But they're just like they say, well, of course, people would rebel. I would rebel if I were in their situation. I think they're pragmatic, racist, but pragmatic. And there is no way that he would not engage in negotiations because he would say, I'm superior to you. I'm not going to engage in that if he thinks it can save his skin and preserve the colony for him. I don't think that their ideology is that hardened. Yeah, I think that would have been more a 19th century thing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question.
We have Tessa Murphy up next. Go ahead, Tessa.
Hi, thank you so much for, sorry about my lack of camera. I don't have a respectable background right now. Okay. Thank you so much for sharing this work with us. I think, as many people have said, I really appreciated how readable it was and your decision to write it for a broader audience. And with that in mind, I wondered if I could ask you how you dealt with questions of violence when writing for a broader audience, both the violence of the revolution or the rebellion itself, and also the violence that was visited on those who participated in the revolution, because I think that can be very shocking even for those of us who work in that area. And I wonder about the decisions you made about how to present that to a broader group. And then picking up on, I think it was Amber's earlier question, I also wondered just what it was like for you to confront those realities in the archive and what that process was like for you as a historian, because I'll just offer a comment. I really appreciated how you contextualized and how you said, what should we make of these accusations of cannibalism, for instance, among the revolutionaries? And also, I really appreciated when you were discussing the executions, how you turned it back and the person, you allowed the person who was being subjected to this unfathomable torture to turn it back around on the person who had inflicted so much suffering on him in slavery. Yeah. So basically, I just thought you did a really wonderful job with very difficult material. And I was wondering if you could reflect on the decisions that led you to do that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that question. And thanks for your kind comments about the book. Early on in the book, I, for instance, described this very deranged slaveholder who rapes women and bites people and beats them arbitrarily. And I struggled with that, trying to weigh, on the one hand, I want readers, particularly white readers, to understand that slavery depends on violence, that it is violence that keeps people in subjection, and that violence turns slaveholders into monsters, and that it keeps enslaved people from living the lives they want to live, obviously, and that people have to deal not only with violence, but a level of arbitrariness where you can never count on anything. And I think that at the moment, and this is a very shallow comparison, but I think that many of us living through COVID are having this sense of that things are not certain anymore, and that is on a minor scale compared to what enslaved people had to deal with. And so I wanted to put some examples in there, and I thought a lot about how to phrase it so it would not be voyeuristic and it would not be sort of the pornography of a slave archive, but it would drive home, particularly for people who don't know much about slavery, the realities of it and what Europeans did in the colonies several hundred years ago, and actually quite up to the present. And with the executions, that was the same. These executions, I had a number of accounts that went into quite a bit of detail about how people were burned at the stake or broken on the wheel. And the student asked what was really surprising. I had never read descriptions of people being broken on the wheel. And when I read it, I couldn't even imagine it. And I struggled with, on the one hand, thinking, I need to make that clear. And on the other hand, thinking, no, it's too much. It's too disrespectful to the people to whom this happened. And I'm not going to do that. So I had some of those descriptions and I took them out. And in the end, I decided that I wanted that chapter about the executions to focus on a particular person so that people would feel empathy for him. And that empathy would then mean that I didn't have to go into that kind of detail to create an empathy, if that makes sense. And I think it's a constant weighing between not wanting to shortchange the horrific realities of it and making it something where readers focus on the violence in a way that makes the people disappear. In terms of how I dealt with it myself, is I definitely think that as a white person, I was affected differently by it than were I to be a person who's a descendant of African people. And that's why I certainly hope that more scholars of color will learn Dutch and delve into those records, because there are a lot of stories to be told and they should not just be told by a white person. But nevertheless, it's incredibly affecting material. And I wanted to do right by everybody I wrote about, but some of these folks were difficult to write about. And I also thought a fair amount about the violence, the intra-rebellion violence, which again, I wanted to make real because it does affect people's choices. But I also figured that the archive might be skewed towards those stories. And so I didn't want to foreground them too much. So it's a process of constant weighing and then letting people read it and say, what do you think? And I'm glad to hear that you think I weighed right, at least most of the time. I doubt I got it right all of the time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody so far. Jessica Johnson had to leave us. She has something else that she needed to go to. So I'm going to take over the last 20 minutes. I see there are no questions. So I'm going to take this opportunity to ask one that I've been holding close to my chest today. And then I'm going to ask Marjoleine if she could say some final words after answering my question before passing it finally to Ana Lucia, or that will close us up for today. So my question to you, Marjoleine, first of all, I just wanted to thank you. It's a great read, like I told you. Thank you for closing the book with Hercules. For the rest of us outside of Holland, I know you're writing this also in part for a Dutch audience, so you had to close with Del and Guggenheim with that message that I'm guessing you want a Dutch audience to take to heart about the lessons not learned. I was struck really by something going back to this theme comparison to Vince's book and yours by this idea of the sliver. I'm not sure that Vince Brown used the word sliver, but he did hint at this throughout his book, that actually the world controlled by the European colonizer is a world of slivers. He doesn't. I don't think he refers to it as
sorry, what?
Of slivers of thin. It's very thin. It's like a web. I think he used the metaphor of the thinness of a spider web. That next to it, if we use our geographical imagination, there's all this world that is not controlled by them. And even though you don't address geography as directly as he does, you do keep coming back to geography. You keep bringing us back to maps from the time period, but also in your prose, you're constantly reminding us of whether we're in a savanna or whether we are in a plantation or in a patch of jungle. You're constantly taking us there to these different landscapes and reminding us that the Dutch only control very little. Now, in reading it through that lens, I felt as if the Akan people, the Amina, as you call them, their ask of the upriver was an ask that would bring them back to the world that they controlled, that they knew in Africa, right? It's an ask of like, you guys can keep the coast, we'll be more protected, safer out here in this land. I was wondering if when you were writing the book, you were doing some of this geographical thinking, and I know that you were also at some point exposed to Vincent's idea and others who are also trying to bring geography into account to these things. As you were trying to think through what it is that makes this pre-revolutionary events unique or similar to others. What geographically was unique about this? What geographically was different here? Trusting these historical events, so energizing.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Alex. And my partner, who's an environmental historian, kept pushing me to do more with geography and environment, and I resisted for various reasons. But the geography of Bearbeast is very specific. I mean, it is a long, thin colony where the Dutch control is both fragile and brutal, right, at the same time. And where many of the decisions made both by the rebels and the Dutch, I think, were with this idea in mind that, for instance, the Dutch flee to the coast pretty quickly, because as soon as they realize that this rebellion is going to be big, they worry that their escape to the coast will be cut off, right? And so rather than defend this area in the middle of the colony where their main government lives, they abandon it because they are so afraid that the rebels will go around New Amsterdam and cut them off, and then they will all be slaughtered. The rebels, I think, are similarly, as you're saying, thinking about, given that this is a long colony that at any moment you can be cut off, what are the best places for us to be? And I think that indeed Kofi first asked for the whole half, and the second set of negotiations, he's a little bit more specific, but all the big sugar plantations he asked for are in the southern part of the colony. I think that indeed he is doing that, so he won't have to defend himself as much from other Europeans who might come, or the Dutch who might come, but also he might be hoping that he can make some sort of alliance with Amerindians, or perhaps eventually Maroons. So the geography of the colony influences people's strategic decisions in a way that Jamaica is a totally different environment. It's mountainous, it's rounder, it's surrounded by water. Had it not been for the Amerindian allies of the Dutch, about whom we have not spoken very much, who create kind of a cordon around Bearbeast in the southern part so that people cannot disappear into the hinterland and set up Maroon communities. There's no way the Dutch would have held on to that colony, despite thousands of soldiers from the Netherlands. They wouldn't have been able to do it. And so the Dutch create boundaries by enlisting the help of Amerindians. And those Amerindians, as I explained in one of the chapters, really make chattel slavery possible in Bearbeast by allying themselves with the Dutch and by saying, okay, we will help you contain these folks who otherwise could too easily disappear into the hinterlands, because it's an incredibly long and porous border. that speaks to what you, and the Dutch are, I talk about landscape too when it comes to the Dutch, because these Dutch soldiers, who are completely, of course, not trained in jungle warfare, are clearly freaked out by this jungle, by how dark it is when you're in there and you can't see anything, and there's snakes and there's spiders and there are bats that suck your toes, and the insurgents have a much better way of dealing with that landscape, which is, I think, to some of them more familiar from where they are from in West Africa. And they don't bluster through in big formations, but they engage much more in sort of guerrilla fighting. And they're able to turn that environment to their advantage militarily, but that environment also hampers them, because you cannot sustain large numbers of people in the jungle without spending several years creating gardens. And so Kofi is constrained too in what he can do, because he can't just move his folks en masse out of the way. So it plays a complicated role, and I'm not sure I always did as good a job with it as I could have. It's clearly something Vince really focused on in a way I did not so explicitly.
Thank you.
So concluding thoughts?
Well, it turns out that we do have a question from Sally Brown. So I think we have time to take it. So Sally, are you there?
Okay, Bill and Sally Brown, I think that I saw a hand at some point that was on the video. And there is Christiana Bastos as well, who wants to ask a question. Then perhaps you can just go with Christiana and see if Bill and Sally want to ask a question. Okay, go ahead, Christiana.
Thank you. Quick question inspired by your incursion into landscape. And apologies for, I'm not an 18th century person at all, but my question goes into geography. I had the chance to visit Jordan Savannah in Suriname. And one of the things that is most talked about it was that there were continuous rebellions and connections with other rebellions. My question to you is there any connection across the region under Dutch jurisdiction that had allowed communication and a network of rebellions in that time, and that connected to Jordan Savannah too?
Okay, thank you for that question. The rebels at some point decide that they are going to go west to Essequibo and Demerara, and that because they need new recruits, they are going to stir those folks up to come and join them. They don't succeed for a number of reasons. It's the rainy season extends longer, I think, than they had anticipated, and the roads are still very much flooded. And the Dutch get reinforcements from Barbados, not in Bearbeast, but in Essequibo or in Demerara, where a prominent American, actually, he's from New England, but he lives in Barbados. He has plantations in Essequibo and Demerara, particularly in Demerara, and he gets an army together without any authorization. He gets all these Navy sailors from the Brits to get onto a boat and go to Demerara. And the Bearbeast rebels hear about this, and they decide that this is not a good time for them to go. As I said earlier, they also try to make supposedly contact with the Maroons in Suriname, whom I think would not have been super sympathetic towards this rebellion. There was quite a bit of enmity between enslaved people and Maroons in Suriname as well. And I think they would have been quite worried about having 4,000 people competing for resources and potentially women. So I'm not sure that they would have endangered their treaties with the Dutch to go help their to help the Bearbeast rebels. What I do know is that within, I think, a week or two of the Bearbeast rebellion, enslaved people in Suriname are singing songs about the Bearbeast rebellion, where they are making fun of the Dutch and talking about, in sly ways, talking about how much they are encouraged by this rebellion. And the Surinamese governor cracks down on it right away. He passes an edict that says, I want all of you to very carefully monitor your enslaved people. They're stirred up about this Bearbeast things. Don't let them sing songs that they're making up. It's not allowed. And you cannot write about this rebellion in your letters because those letters fall into the wrong hands. And he even writes the Dutch governor and he says, I'm secretly censoring the letters of my colonists before I send them on to Europe. And I suggest you do the same thing, because the dangers of rebellion spreading are too great. So there's less concern about Maroons, quite a bit of worry about rebellion spreading, both in Essequibo and Demerara, where they immediately, the Dutch jump into action, and they're very worried that will happen there too, and in Suriname, where it doesn't happen at that time, but they worry about it a great deal. And the investors in Amsterdam use that fear to get the Dutch state to shell out large amounts of money, because they're basically saying, this is a domino. If we allow Bearbeast to go, the rest will go too. And the other colonies, particularly Suriname, are worth so much more money. Yeah.
Thank you, Christiana. So it's 6:50 now. So I think Bill and Sally have like a super quick question. And Marjoleine has a super quick answer. So that we can leave a little room for Ana Lucia to tell us a little bit about our next meeting.
I don't think I like it.
Bill, we can't hear you, Bill, really well. Is that Sally?
Okay, now it's fine.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi. Mario, anybody else ask whether a question the coincidence of your book being published in August and just when the street.
Sally, hold on. We're having really
We're having
bad
a
feedback.
lot of echo, so I couldn't really hear the question.
You want to type it? If you could type it real quick? And I see Laura also.
No, I think that is fine, because there are two. There are two in this. Then now I muted the second account. I think that she can go ahead and ask.
Okay, go ahead.
Has anyone else asked you about or found that the coincidence in your book coming out in August, just when the Black Lives Matter protests were starting from coast to coast in America? Has anybody suggested that it's a strange part of the book where you had discussed earlier about why did the rebellion happen just when it did? Because they, I think it was Kofi who said they'd gone just too far. I mean, it was just too much to put up with.
Mm-hmm.
To me, yeah, go ahead.
Nobody has asked about that, Sally. And of course, the publication of a book is dependent on when the author gets it done. This book should have come out a long time ago. So the fact that it's coming out now is in the midst of the Black Lives Matter protest is coincidence. But I think that it probably increases people's interest in the book a little bit. I think it will do the same in the Netherlands, where Black Lives Matter are, I'm sorry about that, also very active, and where it's causing people to be more interested in that Dutch past. So I
right.
all I can say about it, I think.
Yes. The other thing I heard today that seemed to go along with it was how many facets or how many groups there were among the rebels, people who were not, were on different pages, but on the same page when it came to rebelling.
Yes, I think they're on the same page that they hate slavery. I think, right. And they're on the same page that they want to be in charge of their own lives, but how they want to be in charge of their own lives, that's where I think they differ. Yeah. Well,
Thank
maybe,
you, Sally.
thanks very much. We should maybe turn it back to Anna Lucia so she can tell us.
And I don't know if you want to say a few words or.
No, I think that people asked wonderful questions. Thank you all very much. I think I got to talk a lot, and I really appreciate everybody's attention to the book and for people to have zoomed in. It's hard to keep your attention for such a long time. And again, I really want to thank the conveners. You guys are doing a huge service to the profession and the world at large, I think. Thanks.
Thank you, Marjoleine.
Thank you so much, Marjoleine. And then just to remind you, this is the book, Blood on the River, and it was published then in August by a New Press, and you can get the book. And if you didn't get it yet, and if you didn't read it yet, to know a little bit more about the schedule that we have for the next months and the next year, indeed. Our next meeting is going to be on October 14, the same kind. Then you just go to the slaveryarchive.wordpress.com and you click on October 14, and from there you can register on Zoom, or you can of course watch on YouTube. And this is going to be the book that you are going to discuss in October. Then the story of Rufino, Slavery, Freedom, and Islam in the Black Atlantic. And this is by 3 Brazilian authors, João José Reis, Marcos de Carvalho, and also Flávio dos Santos Gomes, who will be with us. And it's a good opportunity, of course, for us to hear about a work that was published in Portuguese and that was just translated in English and published by Oxford University Press. Otherwise, I thank you then, Marjoleine, for joining us. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Jessica. And thank you to all the audience. And I hope to see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.